Okay, let me walk you through what may be one of the most significant logistical developments in the eastern theater of this war. Because what Ukrainian forces have reportedly accomplished over the past 72 hours goes far beyond a routine disruption of enemy supply operations. What appears to have happened is the culmination of an 11-week effort aimed at isolating a large Russian force operating in the region. At the center of this development is a supply corridor supporting roughly 80,000 Russian troops. According to multiple battlefield assessments, that corridor is no longer functioning as an effective logistics route, and that distinction matters. The route has not simply been weakened or partially disrupted. It has reportedly been cut. The road and rail network responsible for moving ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, equipment, and replacement personnel into this operational grouping is no longer operating in the way Russian planners intended. Ukrainian forces now control key terrain overlooking critical sections of that corridor. Any attempt to restore the route would require Russian forces to fight through prepared defensive positions specifically established to prevent such a recovery effort. For a force of approximately 80,000 soldiers, logistics is everything. Combat operations depend on a constant flow of supplies. Once that flow is interrupted, operational effectiveness begins to decline. This does not necessarily mean those troops are physically surrounded. Rather, it means they may be facing an increasingly difficult logistical reality. Supplies continue to be consumed every day, fuel is burned, ammunition is expended, equipment requires maintenance. And if resupply cannot keep pace, military capability gradually erodes. Stay with me throughout this analysis because we're going to examine how this situation developed, why the corridor was so important, how Ukraine appears to have targeted it, and what the coming weeks could mean if current conditions persist. Having spent decades within NATO's military command structure, including service as Commanding General of United States Army Europe, I have seen firsthand how logistics shapes military campaigns. One of the most important lessons military planners learn is that wars are often decided not only by battlefield victories, but by the ability to sustain forces over time. That is why a successful strike against a major logistics network is never merely a tactical event. It is an operational achievement. And sometimes, operational achievements can reshape the direction of an entire campaign. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Frontline Insight 360 Degrees. Here, we focus on military analysis, operational developments, and the strategic realities behind the headlines. Now let's begin by understanding exactly what this supply corridor represented. Because before we can understand why its loss matters, we need to understand why it became so important. The corridor at the center of this operation was reportedly the last remaining high-capacity logistics route connecting Russian-controlled territory to a large operational grouping conducting offensive activities in the central Donetsk sector. The reason it became so important is that other logistics routes had already been placed under increasing pressure over the past several months. The northern corridor experienced significant degradation after Ukrainian precision strikes targeted bridges, rail infrastructure, and transportation hubs. At the same time, Ukrainian ground operations pushed Russian forces away from terrain controlling key approaches to that route. The southern corridor faced a different challenge. Ukrainian advances in the Zaporizhia region reportedly placed Russian supply movements under continuous surveillance and fire coverage, reducing the efficiency of that network and limiting the volume of supplies that could move through it. As a result, increasing pressure was placed on the central corridor. It gradually became the primary route supporting Russian forces in this sector. Russian planners reportedly viewed this route as the most secure option. It ran through terrain that had remained relatively stable throughout the current phase of the conflict and was considered less vulnerable to Ukrainian pressure than the northern and southern alternatives. In other words, it became the route on which everything increasingly depended. And that is where Ukrainian operational planning appears to have demonstrated considerable sophistication. One of the most misunderstood aspects of modern warfare is logistics interdiction. The goal is not always to destroy every supply route simultaneously. In many cases, the objective is to progressively eliminate alternatives. As options disappear, traffic becomes concentrated on fewer and fewer routes. And once an opponent becomes heavily dependent on a single corridor, that corridor becomes a critical vulnerability. According to available assessments, Ukraine appears to have followed precisely that approach. Pressure was applied to the northern route. pressure was applied to the southern route. And once dependency shifted toward the central corridor, attention focused there as well. The result is a situation where the loss of one route may have consequences far greater than its physical size would suggest. Because when an entire logistics system becomes dependent on a single artery, the disruption of that artery can affect an entire operational grouping. And that brings us to the operation itself. How exactly did Ukrainian forces manage to sever what had become the most important logistics corridor in the sector? That is where the story becomes even more interesting. The operation that ultimately severed the central corridor did not begin with the ground assault itself. According to available reporting, it began roughly 11 days earlier with a carefully coordinated preparation phase. During that period, Ukrainian precision strike assets focused on critical infrastructure connected to the logistics network. Bridges, rail junctions, road intersections, and terrain features associated with potential rerouting efforts became key areas of attention. What makes this phase particularly interesting is that the objective does not appear to have been simple destruction. Instead, the goal seems to have been preparation. Military planners understand that when a major route is disrupted, commanders immediately begin searching for alternatives. The challenge is not merely cutting the primary corridor. The challenge is preventing the enemy from adapting. By establishing surveillance and fire coverage over likely alternative routes before the operation began, Ukrainian planners appear to have anticipated the next move before it happened. At the same time, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces and mechanized units were reportedly moving into position. Their objective was not to seize large areas of territory. Instead, they focused on a small number of strategically important terrain features, particularly elevated positions overlooking key road junctions and rail crossings. Control of those locations would provide observation and fire control over substantial portions of the corridor. When the operation began, Ukrainian forces moved rapidly. Reports suggest the critical objectives were secured within approximately 18 hours. Russian defenders were not necessarily overwhelmed by numbers. Rather, Ukrainian units appear to have exploited weaknesses in the defensive layout. Approach routes that had been considered secondary by Russian planners became the avenues through which the assault developed. As a result, some defensive positions reportedly lacked the strength required to stop the attack. Once the key terrain was secured, the corridor's operational viability came into question. But what happened next may be even more revealing. Russian commanders understood the significance of the situation almost immediately. Within hours, efforts reportedly began to restore control of the corridor. The response was rapid and reflected the urgency of the problem. This was not a case of hesitation. Russian forces recognized the stakes. However, recognizing a problem and solving it are two different things. The first counterattack failed, not necessarily because of a lack of determination among frontline troops, but because the forces available for the mission appear to have been insufficient for the task. Months of continuous combat had already reduced the reserve capacity available in the sector. Units tasked with restoring the corridor encountered defensive positions that had been prepared in advance. Approach routes were reportedly covered by pre-planned fires. Defenders had already studied the most likely directions from which counterattacks would emerge. The result was a difficult tactical environment for any restoration effort. A second counterattack followed several hours later. It also failed to achieve its objective. The next morning, a smaller follow-up attempt was launched. That effort was reportedly stopped before reaching the primary Ukrainian defensive positions. After multiple unsuccessful attempts in a relatively short period of time, Russian commanders faced a difficult decision: continue committing forces to an increasingly costly restoration effort, or begin adapting to the possibility that the corridor would remain unavailable for a longer period. Current indications suggest elements of both approaches are occurring simultaneously. Limited efforts to regain the corridor continue. At the same time, alternative logistics arrangements appear to be underway. The challenge is that alternative routes rarely provide the same capacity as the original network. They tend to be slower, less efficient, and more vulnerable, particularly if they operate under enemy surveillance. Reports also suggest that some frontline units may have begun implementing tighter ammunition management measures. While such measures are not unusual during periods of logistical strain, they often serve as indicators that commanders are attempting to preserve resources while broader solutions are pursued. Now, let's turn to another critical aspect of this operation: intelligence. Because operations of this complexity rarely succeed without extensive preparation. According to available assessments, Ukrainian intelligence efforts spent weeks building a detailed picture of the corridor and its vulnerabilities. This process reportedly combined multiple sources of information: signals intelligence, drone reconnaissance, monitoring of logistics movements, and information gathered from sources operating in Russian-controlled areas. Together, these efforts appear to have identified three crucial factors. First, the locations where disruption would create the greatest impact. Military planners often refer to these as choke points, areas where a road, rail line, bridge, or junction becomes so important that disruption at a single location affects an entire network. Second, intelligence reportedly identified weaknesses in the defensive structure protecting those areas. Some positions were understaffed, others were oriented toward threats from specific directions, while remaining more vulnerable from others. Understanding those vulnerabilities allowed planners to select more favorable avenues of approach. Third, intelligence appears to have helped determine the timing. Every logistics system experiences cycles. There are periods when stockpiles are stronger and periods when they are weaker. Launching an operation during a moment of increased vulnerability can significantly amplify its effect. Taken together, these factors suggest an operation driven by preparation rather than opportunity. The targeted locations reflected intelligence assessments. The approach routes reflected intelligence assessments. Even the timing appears to have reflected intelligence assessments. That level of integration demonstrates how modern warfare increasingly depends on information as much as firepower. And it highlights one of the most important realities of this conflict. The side that understands the battlefield more accurately often gains advantages long before the shooting begins. Which brings us to the larger question. What does all of this mean for the broader war, and what could happen over the next several weeks if current conditions continue? Now let's examine what this development could mean for the broader trajectory of the war, because the significance of this operation extends beyond a single corridor. It raises important questions about the ongoing contest between Ukrainian offensive capabilities and the defensive systems Russia has constructed across the eastern theater. For much of the conflict, Russian operational planning has relied on a fundamental assumption: that key logistics corridors could be protected through a combination of defensive positions, surveillance systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and layered security measures. The apparent success of this operation challenges that assumption, not because every Russian logistics network is suddenly vulnerable, but because it demonstrates that even heavily protected corridors can face significant risk when intelligence, precision strikes, and ground maneuver are effectively combined. Military commanders across the theater are undoubtedly studying what happened. Every logistics route depends on specific terrain features. Every supply network contains critical nodes. And every commander is likely asking the same question: could a similar operation occur elsewhere? That shift in perception matters. Confidence is an important component of military effectiveness. When confidence in a system begins to decline, additional resources must be committed to protection. More troops may be assigned to security missions. More attention may be devoted to logistics defense. And those resources inevitably come from somewhere else. In that sense, the effects of this operation may extend beyond the immediate battlefield. Now let's turn to the next 21 to 30 days, because that timeline may prove decisive. Modern military formations consume enormous quantities of resources every day: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement parts, maintenance equipment. The exact numbers vary depending on combat intensity, but one principle remains constant. Large formations engaged in active combat require continuous resupply. Without it, combat effectiveness gradually declines. Reports suggest that the forces operating in this sector entered the current situation after months of logistical pressure. The northern and southern corridors had already experienced disruptions. As a result, supply efficiency was no longer operating at ideal levels, even before the central corridor became unavailable. That means there was less margin for error. If current conditions continue and alternative routes fail to fully compensate for the loss of the primary corridor, commanders may face increasingly difficult choices. One option would be maintaining the current operational tempo, However, doing so risks accelerating the depletion of available stockpiles. The second option would be reducing operational activity. That approach conserves resources but comes at a different cost. Offensive momentum slows, operational flexibility decreases, and strategic objectives become more difficult to achieve. This is the dilemma logistics often creates. The battlefield may present opportunities, but logistics determines whether those opportunities can be exploited. At the moment, Russian commanders appear to be balancing those competing realities, attempting to sustain operations while simultaneously adapting to a more challenging supply environment. Whether they succeed remains uncertain. Wars are dynamic. New routes can be established. Positions can be retaken. Conditions can change rapidly. And military history is filled with situations that appeared decisive in one month, only to look very different the next. That is why caution is important. But based on the information currently available, there is little doubt that this represents one of the most significant logistics-related developments in the Eastern Theater in recent months. The coming weeks will reveal whether it becomes a temporary setback or something with broader operational consequences. Either way, military planners on both sides will be studying this operation closely, because it offers valuable lessons about logistics, intelligence, preparation, and the increasingly important role of operational planning in modern warfare. I'm Ben, and this is Frontline Insight 360 degrees. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure you subscribe and activate notifications so you never miss our latest strategic assessments and battlefield updates. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe the disruption of this key supply corridor could become one of the most important operational developments in the Eastern Theater this year? Or do you think Russian forces will ultimately adapt and restore the situation before the logistical pressure becomes decisive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching Frontline Insight 360 degrees. And remember, some of the most important battles in modern warfare are not fought at the front line. They are fought along the supply routes that keep entire armies moving. We'll see you in the next analysis.